Good morning, and welcome to Session 2, Reimagining Global Environmental Governance, Technology as Catalyst. I'm Ruby Aidun, a graduate student in the Technology and Policy Program, class of 2026. My research at the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, or CEPR, focuses on the deployment of grid-level energy storage and its role in enabling the energy transition to variable renewable energy sources. This session explores the potential for emergent technologies, from data systems and simulation tools to climate finance platforms, to reshape the architecture of global environmental governance. The panelists will examine the opportunities and challenges for technological innovations to catalyze more effective policy frameworks, mechanisms, and structures to address the urgent challenges of climate change. We are joined today by a distinguished panel of MIT and TPP alumni whose work spans academia, international institutions, and the nonprofit sector. Their leadership and scholarship have helped shape the global discourse on climate policy, environmental data, and sustainable finance. Our panelists, starting with closest to me, is Dr. Catherine Wolfram. She is the Williams Barton Rogers Professor in Energy and Professor of Applied Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Her research spans energy market economics, climate policy, and international trade, including recent work on carbon border adjustments and methane emissions pricing. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy Economics at the US Treasury. Next, we have Dr. Robert Chen, who is Director Emeritus and retired Senior Scientist with the Center for International Earth Science Information Network at Columbia University's Climate School. He has led major initiatives in global disaster and climate risk assessment, sustainability indicators, remote sensing application, and open access geospatial data resources. His career has bridged science, policy, and data stewardship at the highest level of international collaboration. Michael Gillenwater is the Executive Director, Co-Founder, and Dean of the Institute of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. He's a globally recognized expert in greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification. He has served as a lead author for 4 reports of the IPCC and helped design the UN's compliance review systems under the Kyoto Protocol. His work has advanced the professionalism of climate data systems and environmental accounting worldwide. Finally, our moderator is Christi Electris. She is the Executive Director, Co-Founder, and Senior Fellow of the Croatan Institute. A computer scientist and quantitative policy analyst by training, Christi has led pioneering work in sustainable investing, climate justice, and regenerative agriculture. She has been instrumental in the development of global sustainability scenario modeling and impact investing metrics. Please join me in welcoming this remarkable panel. It is now my pleasure to turn the conversation over to our moderator, Christi Electris, who will guide us through today's session.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here today, to be up on stage, and to be here with this amazing panel, group of panelists, distinguished panelists in the space of global governance. Our topic today, our discussion is going to be talking about as the urgency of unified global climate action intensifies, we're seeing record-breaking heat, with 2024 being the hottest year on record again, devastating floods, severe imbalances in the global water cycle, and persistent wildfires across multiple continents. The limited progress of the current institutions calls for a reassessment of existing governance frameworks, and at a time where the realities that we're facing include an ongoing struggle to meet Paris Agreement targets and the persistent finance gaps for adaptation and mitigation, particularly in the global south. We're going to explore today how global environmental governance might evolve into a more dynamic, responsive system, one that empowers low and middle income countries, mobilizes global solidarity, and meets the scale and urgency of the climate challenge with creativity, courage, and collective resolve. We're going to begin with some introductions across the panel, and then we will jump into some questions. To start, I'd like to just give myself an introduction because I have not worked in this space as long as this amazing group of speakers. I'm Christi Electris. I'm Executive Director of the Croatan Institute. We focus on leveraging finance to build social equity and ecological resilience, to create pathways to a just economy. And I was at MIT in the Technology and Policy program while I was pursuing a joint master's with the Tufts Fletcher School of International Relations. I was so grateful for the flexibility and the interdisciplinary nature of the TPP program. I got to work with Professor Nicholas Ashford, who I'm so pleased to see here today, and worked on environmental technology and policy development in a regional system, thinking about, in particular, transboundary water resource management in Southeastern Europe. And while I was at MIT, I also got to work with many different professors in the political science department. I worked with Nazli Shukri. I went on after TPP and grad over to the TELUS Institute that was here in Boston and worked on their global sustainability scenarios and did a lot of thinking about how do you integrate the environmental, economic, and social data and use the trends that we're seeing in order to create scenarios, both for what could market forces lead to and the kind of inconsistencies of what that looks like. What could a policy reform and global governance help us bend the curve into a more sustainable world and global society? And we also explored scenarios of extremes. What would it look like if we lead towards collapse or fortress worlds of increasing social inequality? And the hope was that we can make it towards a great transition where we would lead towards the values that would prioritize social equity, ecological resilience, and help us transition beyond the policy mandates, but actually because we all wanted to see that happen. And I'm still hopeful that we'll get to that. But at that point, I started connecting with the importance of implementing the change that we want to see in the world in order to, especially at the time in 2014 when I co-founded Croatan Institute, it was feeling more and more difficult to get policy done, at least in the United States. I became interested in the importance of finance and making that happen. And so we founded this organization where we really focus on research and action. So our approach is about creating sustainable long-term change in both the capital markets and on the ground to build both social equity and ecological resilience. And we work with investors and financial decision makers in order to help provide them resources on how to redirect their finance to more regenerative and restorative impacts. And we work with communities on the ground in order to help them access the tools of finance and meet their needs and that support resilient and flourishing ecosystems and communities. And over the past decade, we've been building the field of impact investing by bridging and connecting different stakeholders and perspectives, both capital providers and capital seekers. So we can talk about more of that later. But I'm very excited now to kind of zoom back out and look at the global governance system and think about, I mean, the financial flows is a big piece of that, but what we're going to talk about today is really going to be looking back at the climate conventions and thinking of how we are working together and how can we improve that. So I'm going to pass the next introduction to Bob, who has one of our most experienced graduates of TPP.
Thanks. Well, nice to be back here. I guess I'm one of the grads from the 80s, along with Frank and a few others. And I'm at the end of my career. It's been nice to hear about the people at the beginning or early in their career. So what I thought I'd reflect on was, in our title, the disparity between global environmental governance, which I think is a slow to change, long-term issue, and technology, which changes fast, and the intersection between those. So I've lived through at least what I would call 3 technological revolutions that have affected governance. What you have to remember is, in the old days, and still now, international governance is by treaty. So countries sign treaties in environmental arena, it was by topic. Not every country signed on. Once a treaty got a critical mass to come into force, there was a whole timeline for it happening. So any particular country might or might not have signed on to any number of environmental treaties. And back actually before the internet, you had to call the State Department or a foreign ministry to find out who signed up to what and when, and did they have exceptions and this and that. So when the internet came along, you could finally digitize that, but it was still hard to get at that information. And one of my first projects at CIESIN, which was a nonprofit at that point, was putting all that into an Oracle database that you could query online. And just to get a sense of what treaties applied when, if you sent in a mission, what treaties would that mission have to follow to be compliant and in that country. A second revolution was the geospatial revolution, including both things like geographic information systems and satellites. So in the old days, decision makers they made decisions about countries or about administrative regions that they were from. As we all know, environmental factors, air, water, they cut across national boundaries. So when a decision maker made a decision, they only wanted to know, well, how does it affect my country? And more importantly, when they agreed to a policy or set up a policy, it applied to the whole country, but not necessarily the next country or others. So governance was very patchwork based on national boundaries. When the geospatial revolution, and particularly satellites, came along, people could at least start assembling data and making policies that didn't just apply evenly to the whole country, but was more, could be more nuanced in terms of the effect not only on your own population, but on neighbors and so forth. So governance still was based nationally, but at least you had the means to understand and address geographic and other differences. And I think we're at a third revolution now where technology is giving us lots more data, not just what you can see, but what people are doing, what their motivations are, what they're thinking about a problem. And I think that's sort of where some of this, our discussion could be. Can that change governance? Because countries are still in charge. We see it every day when countries don't want to cooperate or participate. But there are possibilities where people, through technology and companies and other actors, can actually make a difference through technology. But again, that technology is not free from national control, as we have had some recent examples. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you. And let's turn to Catherine.
Great. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. I want to do a bit of a deep dive on climate, but I think it mirrors a lot of the issues that Bob just set up. So on climate, we've relied on treaties. We had the Kyoto Protocol. The US never actually got that ratified in the Senate. We have the Paris Agreement. As many of us know, Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, withdrew the US. And so to my mind, the system of global governance that climate has operated under, with the UN leading these annual meetings and these treaties, is really under stress. I think the good news is that there are emerging policies that are going to help drive progress forward in ways that don't rely on these kind of unanimous, let's all hope that people sign the treaty and then hope that they agree to actually enforce the treaty. So what I have in mind are climate and trade policies. And the European Union has already enacted a policy that basically goes like this. The European Union right now has a price on carbon emissions. If you manufacture steel in the European Union, you have to pay for the carbon emissions associated with that manufacturing. And starting January 1st, 2026, imports into the EU also have to pay a carbon price. So if you're a Malaysian steel producer and you're trying to export to the EU, you will have to pay that carbon price. unless you've already paid something in Malaysia. And so I've done some work with co-authors showing that already the European Union policy, it's not yet enforced. There's not money changing hands. Malaysian steel producers don't have to pay the price yet. But it's led to this kind of huge upsurge in interest in carbon pricing across the world. And really, it started a global conversation about, how actually do we drive decarbonization in these traded goods that are subject to something like the border adjustment the European Union is enacting. And so kind of stepping back from a governance perspective, what this does is it introduces a mechanism by which we can, in the words of an economist, I'll be pretty blunt, we can punish countries that try to stay out of treaties and try to, let the rest of the world do it. Because if you remain outside an agreement like this, or kind of a mechanism like this, and you are not pricing carbon, but many other countries are pricing carbon and doing border adjustments, then basically like every time you try to export, your industry is gonna hit this border adjustment. And they're gonna pay the carbon price. And then, the hope is that they go back to their government and say, look, we're already paying the carbon price every time we export, but we're writing a check and sending it to a foreign government. If we put on the carbon price, then we get to keep the revenue. And so the hope is that there's some kind of, virtuous cycle like that, where countries are encouraged / incentivized / pushed in some cases to do the right thing and try to mitigate carbon emissions. So I've been working on, right now there's the European policy, and that's had some of these good effects like I described, but it's also, there's some parts of it that people don't love. But what I've been working on is trying to take the good parts of the European Union's policy and address the bad parts and really call for a coalition of countries. And that coalition can be small in the beginning. It could be the European Union, Brazil, China, 3 countries, but a lot of emissions. And if those countries get together, discuss carbon pricing, discuss border adjustments, then hopefully this becomes kind of a magnetic coalition and draws other countries in to do the same thing. So I don't know if that's like my time or if I'm way out of time. But we can get into this more in the panel. We've been working with the Brazilian government. Brazil is hosting the COP this year, and they are elevating this idea of a coalition. So I have some optimism that over the next couple of years, we'll see progress along these lines. And eventually, countries like the US that are trying to stay out of it will be pushed to do the right thing.
Thank you. Michael.
I've sort of made a career out of doing things counter to the expectations, so I'm going to take a little bit of a different tack. One, I just think it's funny and amazing that we're here to celebrate TPP, and all we can do is talk about technology policy. So I just wanted to celebrate TPP for a second. Because it was very transformative for me. I was a small town, thank you. I was a small town Texas kid, never really been outside of the small town I grew up in. Studied engineering, like a lot of kids that do TPP or science. And this was, a new world for me. It really was. Wow, I didn't think I was going to get emotional. And out of it, I learned about policy, learned about economics and all these things. Met probably the best friends I have right now through this program, and then went on to work in EPA in Washington, D.C., for the UN, did NGOs, participated in Kyoto Protocol negotiations, worked on IPCC reports, like the bio said. Traveled way too much for my carbon footprint, and still do. I hesitated even to come here for that reason. went on to, because there was like more I wanted to do, went on to do other masters and a PhD in international relations, environmental policy and economics. And then on to continuing with the theme of like doing, counter to the norm. Decided that the kind of things I want to do, I couldn't find a place to do it, so I just started my own NGO to do it. And now our focus is on teaching environmental practitioners at the professional level, so people like TPP students that are coming out, about how to take these multidisciplinary, more academic skills and apply them in a practical way toward climate mitigation, toward greenhouse gas mitigation. So we have over 12,000 alumni around the world that are the people doing the reporting under the Paris Agreement, that are people, essentially doing the technical work underneath carbon markets, that are doing, climate mitigation planning in cities, that are doing all the stuff that's going on in the corporate and the kind of net zero space. And so the topic of, going back to the topic of international environmental governance, well, let me stop. No. I'm going to keep being countercultural here. And I think so now I have a daughter. She's studying engineering. And electrical engineering is the energy system stuff that we just saw the previous panel talk about. And I just had a conversation with her last night. Wow, it's surprising how emotional I'm getting. And I was telling her about this panel. And she said, I'm starting to get interested in policy stuff. Because before she was like, how would you say? Very technical. Like if it wasn't purely, you can see this pattern in a lot of TPP students. It's like, if it's not hardcore technical, she's not interested in it, right? It has to be like serious engineering. And this was the first time I heard her say, yeah, she's starting to see this bigger world of complexity, of policy, of economics, of social issues. Yeah, I'm just glad programs like TPP exist.
I really appreciate that, Michael. I think that for me as well, it was transformative to be in a place where you're encouraged to see the connections between these different things, not encouraged to silo into your little domain. I think it's a huge strength of the technology and policy program, and great.
Now, if we want to talk about like international treaties and IR and MRV systems and stuff, we can spend the next 45 minutes or whatever doing that. I'm happy to go. We can geek out as much as we want.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, our first question is to really think about, Catherine, you mentioned, right, the current system where we're all supposed to agree and all, unanimously approve these treaties and sign on isn't really working. That's kind of why I took the finance route. But what are the new architectures and institutions of global cooperation and accountability that could be possible, and what's the role of technology in reshaping these sorts of planetary collaborations on environmental stewardship so we can actually catalyze more effective climate action? So I'll start with you, Catherine, since you have started us off a little bit on that path, and the rest of the panel.
Sure. So the architecture that I was describing, some people refer to it as plurilateral, minilateral, akin to, but not exactly the same as the multilateral system that exists now. I think with any architecture, it's really important to be able to measure and monitor whether there is compliance. So for instance, in the architecture that I'm describing, this climate coalition, you want to know that other countries are actually enforcing carbon pricing, not just that they have something on the books, but that they're making the firms pay. So I've been pretty buoyed, and I'd be curious to hear the panelists' reaction to this by the advents, and I will say I'm an economist, I'm not a technologist, I'm a consumer of technology and an admirer of technology, but not a producer. But I've been really encouraged by the progress that I've seen in satellite monitoring. So for instance, I'm doing some analytical work, looking at global emissions in aluminum, in steel, in cement, in these heavy industries They account for almost 20% of global emissions, like more when you include the electricity associated with those sectors. And we have plant-by-plant data on emissions and production, and a lot of it is coming from a company called ClimateTrace, or an organization called ClimateTrace, and they're using satellites and kind of machine learning to, where we have on-the-ground data, they can match the satellite to the on-the-ground data and then extrapolate to places where we don't. So, is that a technology that can help us really enforce an agreement, or at least monitor it, and then if people aren't, in my scenario, charging the carbon prices that they're supposed to be charging, then they're subject to the border adjustment. So there's a result to not participating in it.
Thanks. Bob?
Yeah, I think there's a core issue that we have to address if we're thinking about alternatives, like satellite monitoring. That's an example where it's easy to take for granted that the satellites will be there and available and trusted by all the parties involved. And we see evidence that, like the cancellation of some recent CO2 missions at NASA, that's not necessarily the case. And related to that is the data free and open once it's released? And again, that's not a given that we have a lot of commercialization of the satellites, and the data coming out of theirs is considered proprietary with some exceptions. So as with most technologies, a lot depends on who controls it, who owns it, and that sort of thing. One of the side areas I worked on, I have a paper written with 3 lawyers, is about the open access to data. We in the US take this thing called the public domain for granted, but public domain doesn't necessarily exist internationally. And other aspects of data ownership and sharing is actually a challenging issue, and it conflicts sometimes with national sovereignty, because national security laws, for example, can be used to restrict access to data and exercise control. And the same with social media as a way to influence global opinion. Obviously, it's having more effect than it had in the past, but there are attempts to control the people who host those networks and resources. So we're sort of at an inflection point, whether AI is very effective if it accesses a lot of data, but people are realizing that and trying to silo back the data so it can't be mined. So what's the trade-off between those tensions of better AI through more data, or AI islands that do well with what they have but don't understand what they don't have access to? So we're at an inflection point, and a lot just depends on how society treats these technologies as to whether they can facilitate new mechanisms that go beyond countries or not.
Michael, you've worked in greenhouse gas emission measurement and tracking. How do you see these institutions evolving to better incentivize reductions in climate solution?
Yeah, maybe we could step back for a minute. The original kind of approach, going back to the Kyoto Protocol, was sort of, countries would have caps. We'd look at all emissions from everything, greenhouse gas emissions from everything. There would be, targets, and everyone would report, and there would be, going back to international relations theory, there's no real enforcement mechanisms, but there would be like strict compliance, and there'd be this quasi-enforcement. So if you missed your target, you would get some punishment in terms of the next target would be even more intense, with the expectation that everyone would stick to it. Obviously, that didn't play out so well in terms of an architecture for treaty architecture. So now we switch to the Paris Agreement, where still everyone it has targets, and actually technically it's even like more expansive because now more developing countries are kind of brought in with like kind of more serious targets. But that the country gets to set their own target instead of like a joint negotiated target. So you get to pick your level. And now we're seeing that's struggling. In my space, it's all built on this system of national reporting called biennial transparency report every 2 years. That's the part of the system that we support heavily, and a lot of countries aren't even reporting. And so the idea is what's called the enhanced transparency framework, that everyone's going to be very transparent about what they're doing, not that their targets and their missions, but all the things they're doing underneath that to address their emissions. It's not playing out as we hoped. For whatever reasons, we can go into that. A lot of countries are reporting, but a lot of countries aren't. And now, this sort of happens every time essentially a Republican administration comes in, and especially in this period of increased nationalism. Now we have talk of, maybe a global architecture isn't the way to go. Maybe we just need to have these, smaller groups of the willing or whatnot, that are willing to maybe move forward on energy or move forward on agriculture, or the EU and maybe a few other countries are willing to work together as the path, and then hopefully the stragglers, or the kind of naysayers, the Saudi Arabias, now the United States and others will eventually come along. And if the club kind of creates enough of a cost to not being part of the club, through things like a border adjustment tax, tariff, that it'll expand over time. But you can kind of see how all of that kind of the monitoring, compliance, enforcement was sort of key to things kind of progressing or not progressing the way we would hope. In Kyoto, it was we couldn't really stick to the targets, and people didn't really trust the numbers necessarily. To now, even with what we call CBAM, it's really just limited to a few commodities, things that we know we can measure very easily, like the whole structure of the system. Aluminum, steel, cement, like a few things we know, very energy intensive, pretty homogenized commodities that are not necessarily globally traded in all cases, but widely traded. It's not covering the whole economy. It's not, it's like all the little gadgets you import from China and other countries. Those are not captured in it. It's too complex. We don't know how to evaluate the carbon footprint of these things. And so I guess the way I think about it is, what we can both measure with confidence, and do so over time, and that enough countries can do that, and you can verify what they're doing, which is where the satellites come in to play, where we can go over and check. Okay, they've sent this data in, but we can see with the satellite that that's actually not really what's happening. One of the issues with the satellites is, although we're getting better, there's a lot more satellites up there. They still only pass by every once in a while, right? So if you have a plant that's running continuously, you can get snapshots. Maybe every day, maybe not every day, but just like a quick snapshot. And so what we work on a lot is how do you combine these different data sets so that you're not relying on one and you can trust them.
Yeah. I think I'd like to dig in a little bit to why you feel, why are we not actually seeing the countries reporting, people stepping up? Because what we do see, we had a great panel just a minute ago about the modeling of what is happening, what's coming. I hear that this year we're likely to hit that 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures. And there's things that are starting to go to whack. So why do you see that state actors are not willing to step up and do the measurement that they had committed to. And then, what is it about the new policies or the new structures that can help us overcome that? What new technology or data systems are going to help us kind of get through to those countries? I can start over there, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's new is this idea of there being a cost to staying out. It's right now a trade cost. There's an economist who won the Nobel Prize for kind of writing down the idea of a carbon club, and in his model, it was a punitive tariff. It wasn't just like an adjustment for what countries were paying already domestically, or companies in, for instance, the EU were already paying, but it was a punitive tariff on all goods that are traded. So you can think about increasing the punishment, essentially, to the extent that's needed. I mean, I honestly think that the other thing that's changed is the US stance. And I worked in the US government, I worked on sanctions at the time, and I really saw how much of a leader the US is, and just how much other countries defer to us, both at the technocratic level, but also at the political level. And so I think it's pretty important that Trump has made it very, very clear that we're not a leader. And so other countries need to figure out how to do things without the US. But I kind of think that that's a good message, that's a message that the rest of the world need to hear. I think that the US is a fraught leader in the climate domain. We're the biggest producer of oil and natural gas. A statistic I like is that now in the G20, so G20 covers more than 80% of the global economy, 20 biggest entities, it's countries plus the EU. All but 3 have some form of federal carbon pricing. The 3 that don't are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. So as somebody coined to me recently, it's like the autocratic petrostates in a group. But yeah, it's an extreme characterization, but I do think that climate politics are challenging in the US in a way that they aren't in other countries. So hopefully some of those other countries will step up and take leadership.
I guess I'd build on that point, which is I do think, especially coming from a place like MIT, that we tend to take the assumption that decisions are based on evidence as the guiding principle of the world. And, diplomacy and treaties were not evidence-based. They were power-based and consensus-based and political. And so there is a tension that especially when the US isn't just withdrawing, but trying to undercut sources of evidence, and therefore the kinds of decisions, making the normal kinds of decisions less possible by undercutting it, that's a typical power play that's occurring that people don't fully get. And for technology to have a role, it needs a role in decision-making. It needs that kind of core assumption of evidence-based decision-making. And, I'm not sure how to get out of that problem, but we're facing sort of the underlying tension of those different forces.
I'll just add, in this moment, it really is technology that I think is shifting things. There's all the satellite and all the better data and whatnot, but the international treaties, again, you're not really forcing any country to do anything they don't want to do. All you can do is hopefully kind of create a little bit of international peer pressure, and have them go through, just the process of engaging in the negotiations, that kind of status game, and the analytical process of kind of forcing, if countries want to play that status game and go to the big UN meetings and all this stuff, they need to, kind of put in table stakes, which is, do the analysis, do the reporting, kind of have some sort of plan, mitigation plan, nationally determined contribution and transition plan. And that, the hope is that influences things, like just getting the policymakers and whatnot, the politicians talking about that and thinking about that and putting it on the agenda has impact. And that's, to be honest, like not a lot more than the treaties can do. But a key change here, and like saying something that like is said 1,000 times a day in every article and podcast, but the fact that low carbon or whatever low emitting technologies is now cheaper and more more available. We have the supply, solar panels, blah 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 blah. Has put it on the agenda. And those two things combined, the fact that the technology is there and it's on the policy agenda now, and there's they see that yeah, we could just like build another gas plant or coal plant or whatnot, or just keep running our farming system the same way, or we could do this other thing that we're going to get lauded for internationally, and actually like our own analysis that we're starting to do internally and submitting to the UN, so now it's public, is saying actually this might be a better path, both economically and sustainable development-wise, and for our environmental health. Instead of this being a cost, it's now a benefit, and that is changing the conversation in a lot of countries. My team spends a lot of time working in these developing countries, helping them do this work, and training their staff in the environment ministry and the trade ministries and whatnot, and not telling them what to do. We're not an advocacy group, but like helping them get the analysis and the information and the skills so that they can do their own analysis and make those decisions. And it has shifted. Over the last 30 years, I've seen it.
Yeah, I think technology and being able to do that analysis more easily on your own is definitely part of the solution. I know that in my space, we're doing a lot of work on investing in regenerative agriculture for climate and ecological, social reasons, and measuring carbon is a big challenge because, first of all, the science is still developing, but there's opportunities to use tools now with satellites and other remote sensing and GIS models. I wonder if we might talk about the types of digital tools or cross-disciplinary data sets, advances in measurement, reporting, and verification, and other platforms that are shaping the way that we can commit, that nations can collaborate and commit to act. So if there's anything that's been promising that you see coming out, or things that you've worked on that you're seeing as kind of a light in helping us gather that data. You've mentioned some of that, so maybe we'll start this way.
This is sort of a joke. Like, it's all just going to be on the blockchain, so it'll take care of it. Sorry, that's a joke in my field, but.
Yeah. So secured blockchain data.
No, that's sincerely a joke. It's not. I'm not serious at all. Like, it's not going to all be on the blockchain.
Plenty of groups focusing on that. Right?
Now, value chains are, so a lot of my work currently is on the voluntary corporate space, because we've seen a lot of, as some governments, which we all know who they are, have kind of pulled back. This again happens every time, that oftentimes the national politics shift in the US and sometimes in other countries is, when the government steps back, the certain parts of the private sector step up, and sometimes local, what we call subnational, local governments step up. We saw it when we pulled out of Kyoto. We saw it when the last Trump administration. Actually, we're not seeing it as much this time, but which is a whole nother dynamic we could talk about what's happening to our politics, that people are afraid to step up. But so there's a lot of activity going on right now. With Google and others, companies willing to put real money down and make real investments, like counter to their short-term profitable objectives toward climate mitigation. I mean, they're like starting up new nuclear plants and investing in big solar and carbon capture and storage and all sorts of stuff. And that's just from the business standpoint, it's mostly pure cost. Not in all cases, but in many cases. And that's one where how do we recognize companies for what they're doing? What sort of data and technology so that we're recognizing the right companies as climate leaders, and not, I get what you say. In this dynamic, there's always this risk of companies will have a tendency to overclaim, obviously, because it's greenwashing, blah 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 blah, and then they get attacked, and then that discourages from them doing it again, and discourages other companies from doing it. So then you get this kind of negative reinforcing cycle of the potential for kind of voluntary corporate action gets neutered. And so how do we prevent that so that it's a positive cycle of companies get recognition, other companies want to get even more recognition, and you spin up. And so there's a dynamic. And clearly at the heart of that is, good data, good analysis, credible, numbers that say, yes, we're recognized, this company is being recognized for being a climate leader, and they really are a climate leader. This is not greenwashing, and everyone can trust it, and here's the data, and here's the transparency. And that is a big debate going on. There is an area of international environmental governance, related to this in terms of non-state actors and things like that. So, I think that's an area of a lot of potential. Again, going back to as these technologies get cheaper, how do we foster the private sector taking more action, given the fact that governments aren't?
Yeah. I think there is a lot of potential, of course, in all the digital tools and social media we have. I've noticed on Lyft the other day that, of course, you get an option for a, quote, green hybrid car, and you can pick it. And, there are a lot of small actions that are starting to filter in. I think, the tricky part is how do you affect bigger actions that are collective, like in terms of city planning or transportation investments and so forth. And can you make those, can technology help facilitate those, despite, efforts to, say, undercut the EV industry or whatever. So, there is a lot of potential there. I do think AI is going to add to that, but also has its own challenges in terms of contributions to greenhouse gases and so forth. But to better optimize what we do and cut across, national boundaries and such. Again, I think the important issue is sort of where does the control come from when there are big changes that need to be made or unpleasant news that has to be shared, right? And will that stay independent of kind of some of the contravailing forces that are at play?
Yeah, I guess I would just broaden the conversation a little bit. We've been talking about ways in which technology will intersect with global governance. And one important way that we haven't talked about is climate interventions like geoengineering. So I had a conversation yesterday with a couple scientists at MIT, and we were talking about the AMOC, the kind of Gulf Stream that keeps Europe temperate to live in, that sustains the oceans the way we know them, fisheries the way we know them. And there are technologies that people are talking about that will suck the heat out from under the glaciers so that the glaciers don't slide into the ocean. And so there are lots of decisions about, who should pay for that, who should approve whether the technology is working. Maybe it's good for some countries, not so good for other countries. Maybe it'll disturb the fish flow for the Peruvians or something like that. So lots of kind of thorny, interesting ways in which technology and global governance will interact in the future.
Yeah.
I'll just add, I mean, yeah, I think that's an area where, I mean, you see the most intense debates in the kind of global environmental governance has been on this, geoengineering for the layman's talk. Carnegie and a bunch of other groups have had some really interesting work on it. I mean, we've seen it entering popular culture, the Ministry of the Future, and I think there's the Apple TV show, I forget, that had on, climate futures, just some rogue actor or someone just like basically geoengineering the planet. I think I took a class here, limnology, God knows why I took limnology. Part of what we were doing was looking at iron fertilization, this back in the 90s. But I mean, when you think about it, one of the key things about any of these geoengineering is it's not like it just is like automatic, it's going to return Earth back to where it was. It's going to cause distributional impacts. So it might be, cooler here, but hotter here, and drier here, and wetter there. And essentially, in a sense, one country could essentially re-engineer the weather of another country without their permission. And you can, I mean, if you can't see the global environmental governance challenges there, then.
Right. Yeah, I think that's why it's important. We can't abandon these opportunities to collaborate globally because we're not isolated. We can't be in silos, just like the work that we do is integrated. I think we might have time for a question or two, if someone would like to. There's a mic there, if you don't mind, you can come on up to the mic. Thank you.
Good morning. My name's Karina Funk, TPP97. Nice to see many of you.
Finally, someone from
and a nice round number of 30 years since I started TPP. I wanted to connect the dots with this panel and the previous one. Nestor from Google said that there really is an appetite to take on risk that, given the mismatch between corporates and particularly hyperscalers want to go really fast, and the risk mitigation of not having electricity customers foot a bill or have compromised service. So in terms of technology as a catalyst in this panel, and some of the stuff that Catherine, Christi, your institute is doing, where do you see do you already see capital allocation and financial innovation in these new ways? Or where do you see the low-hanging fruit is to solve some of these problems with these new risk actors and capital allocation, really being there being an appetite there?
Yeah, thank you. I think I just came from a conference, which has grown enormously, on regenerative food system investing in the US, and they have now a European conference, and they're starting a Canadian one. There's a huge appetite for investing in this transition to more sustainable agricultural production because of the reasons. There's some people that are doing it for climate and food systems. I mean, we all saw what happened during COVID when the food system broke down. We have a very brittle global system in trade. So how do we become more resilient at the local and regional level? And so people are looking at, and not only that, the soil, the number of years of topsoil left if we continue using industrial agricultural production is limited, maybe 30 years, I think. I don't remember what the latest data is today, but so people, even the big actors, the big food production companies, General Mills, they're starting to invest in regenerative. Sometimes we're not sure if it's greenwashing or not because the data is not always clear, but they are recognizing that they need to manage this risk because if there's no food production, there's no business, there's no income, there's no stock markets. So I think it is a transition where people are starting to recognize there's more to it than just your own interests. And so some big companies can pivot and just deplete another region, and others are seeing the benefit in actually managing the risk, investing in their producers and their supply chain and supporting them to do those transitions. But I think the data and the technology is improving, and we're seeing a lot of new technologies have using AI, for example, to measure biodiversity from the sounds of the forest, rather than having to go out and count the measurements. So there's a lot coming that will help us do some of this better. Another question.
Hi, my name is Katie Piccioni. I'm the class of 2018 TPP, and I currently work at NASA in NASA's disasters program. So I'm curious about the conversation around satellite imagery in particular, no surprise. My observation of satellite, kind of the availability of satellite resources as the commercialization of space has advanced, in particular over the last 5 years or so, there is a trend toward commercialization of imagery as a resource. And so, with the exception of NASA and ESA, there are very few public satellite data sets available. And so, what I see from the disasters perspective is that satellite companies sell data to ostensibly emergency managers, although there are perhaps funding issues there. And so this provision of satellite imagery as a service is really driven by, investors and investments and the ability to make a profit. And I'm curious whether the panel has seen similar trends in technology that could be supporting, better environmental governance or climate action, kind of drawing back to this discussion of why aren't we doing these things that we know need to be done. And so, I see this kind of drive for, or rather, the perverse incentives of having cost be a driver for the limitation on use of a technology. But I'd be curious if this is something you've seen in other places as well. Thank you.
I can start. Through the work at the IPCC, this is the methodology work under the IPCC on how countries report. We in the past we've done a whole range of things thinking about the role of satellite data, primarily for the purpose of verifying other data that countries are reporting. And it's always been, going back to the international environmental governance issue, there's always been a catch where it couldn't, no one felt comfortable within the negotiations process of really, I don't want to say mandating it, but kind of more forcefully kind of expecting countries to use it. Because, in the past it was just governments that held the data, like US and a couple other countries had satellites. And can Brazil, as being one of the key actors that complained about this, be reliant on a US satellite data for their treaty compliance reporting? Like it doesn't work, right? It's like some other country is controlling what I'm reporting. Like there's all sorts of trust issues there. And now with what you say with the private sector coming in, and a plethora of different platforms. The issue's still there, but now, of course, it's like, can I trust this private sector corporation with this profit motive to do it? To me, like the one hope is that because we do increasingly have multiple platforms measuring the same thing, that now we're into like expecting kind of collusion amongst all these different government and private sector partners to kind of screw over a country is like far less likely. And so countries are getting increasingly comfortable with it. Some of them are obviously launching their own platforms as well, either through their own private sector actors or government actors. But it's like that kind of concern over like being able to use and trust the data. Because in many cases some of the data was there. Obviously, it's gotten dramatically better, but it's the fact that we have multiple versions of it that are able to kind of like check each other, not just from a data quality standpoint, but from a governance standpoint and trust standpoint, is changing things.
Thank you.
Do
you want to add one thing?
Yeah.
And then we're going to have to wrap up, I think.
Yeah.
The thing is last comments.
Sure. Well, first off, probably sympathies if you're on furlough, which allows you to be here.
Good point.
So I ran a NASA data center for 25 years, and it was canceled by DOGE earlier this year. So I have a direct experience. So I mentioned commercial satellites. That's possibly a good thing, of course, because having entities that are not dependent on public funding and public policy, at least financially, is potentially good as having alternatives, just as you said, multiple sources. So, it's important to have governments step up to this, multiple governments, and it's, I think, probably important in the future to have the balance of private sector, non-government funded groups. And not the private sector that likes to take money from, through indirect subsidies, like a certain communications company we know.
Just 10 seconds. There's a theorem in economics that once a measure drives policy, it's no longer a good measure. Like once it's kind of something that makes money or power flow, it ceases to be a good measure. It's a good issue. Good question.
Well, thank you everyone for this amazing panel, Catherine, Bob, and Michael. Great to have this conversation. Thank you.